Some children describe cities they have never visited. They know the names of people they have never met, and sometimes they describe how they died. According to researchers, many of these stories are not fabricated, but science still cannot explain how they are possible. Today we're going to examine what might happen after death. Is reincarnation just a belief, or is it a phenomenon science has not yet fully explained? And by the end of this video, we'll take a closer look at the case of a boy named James, a case that makes the question, is death really the end? Far more unsettling than it sounds. What actually happens when we die? This may be the one question humanity has never stopped asking. Death is the only event we know will happen with absolute certainty, yet we understand it the least. From a scientific perspective, death begins as a biological process. The heart stops, blood circulation ceases, oxygen no longer reaches the brain, neural activity gradually declines. But death is not as instantaneous as we often imagine. Even after the heart stops, the brain can remain active for a short period of time. In some recorded cases, researchers have observed brief surges in brain activity during the moments surrounding death. During these moments, people who survive clinical death often report similar experiences: a distorted sense of time, a feeling of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel, or seeing an intense light. Science explains these experiences through neurochemistry, oxygen deprivation, and the brain's final attempt to impose order and meaning. In short, science can describe what the body is doing. But when it comes to consciousness itself, the explanation becomes far less clear. Because consciousness remains one of the biggest unsolved problems in neuroscience, is consciousness nothing more than a byproduct of brain activity? If so, when the brain shuts down, consciousness ends, like a screen going dark when the power is cut. But if consciousness is something the brain processes rather than produces, then death may not be a full stop. It may be a transition. And that possibility leads to a question humans have asked for thousands of years. Can consciousness continue in some form after death? This is where the concept of reincarnation enters the discussion. Reincarnation is often dismissed as a cultural belief or a spiritual idea, but historically it has appeared across many civilizations. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato argued that the soul could pass from one body to another. Similar ideas appeared independently in multiple societies across history. This suggests that reincarnation is not tied to one specific culture, but rather to a recurring human attempt to explain what happens to consciousness after death. From a religious standpoint, reincarnation is not universally accepted. In most monotheistic traditions, including Christianity and Islam, there is one earthly life followed by an afterlife. However, even within these belief systems, consciousness or the soul is not considered to simply disappear. The idea of continuation exists. The disagreement lies in its form. Science, however, draws a firm boundary here. Reincarnation is not accepted as a proven fact. There is no known biological mechanism that explains how a personality or memory could transfer from one body to another. But science also does not entirely dismiss certain cases that challenge simple explanations, particularly cases involving very young children who claim to remember details of a previous life. Researchers approach these cases with caution. Children are imaginative, suggestible, and easily influenced. Most claims fall apart under scrutiny. But a small number of cases remain difficult to explain, not because they prove reincarnation, but because they contain verified details the child seemingly had no way of knowing. One of the most well-documented cases occurred in the United States. This is where the story of James Leininger begins. James was born in the U.S. and had a completely normal early childhood, until around the age of 2, when he began waking up at night screaming from the same recurring nightmare. In these episodes, James said his plane was on fire. He moved his hands as if he were inside a cockpit, reenacting the crash again and again. At first, his parents assumed it was just a typical childhood nightmare, but James didn't just describe a plane, he described technical details. He talked about engines, wings, and specific damage. He used terminology that would be highly unusual for a child his age. Then the statements became more specific. He told his mother that his plane had been shot down by the Japanese. He said he was a pilot. And eventually, he said something that stopped his parents completely. "My name isn't James. My name is James Houston." This was no longer vague imagery. It was a specific claim. His father began researching U.S. military records. What he found was unsettling. There had been a pilot named James Houston who served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His aircraft had been shot down by Japanese forces. He died when his plane crashed into the ocean. James later identified the aircraft carrier his plane took off from, the USS Natoma Bay. Historical records confirm that this carrier was involved in the exact mission James described. The details matched, not symbolically but factually. The question became unavoidable. How could a toddler know this? James also reacted strongly to World War II-era aircraft, showing fear and distress while remaining unaffected by modern planes. His emotional responses appeared tied to a specific historical context he had never experienced. As James grew older, the memories faded. Today, he lives a normal life with no clear recollection of these events. What makes James's case truly unique is not just the details he described, but how those details were handled. At this point, science does not take the easy path by simply dismissing the story. Instead, it does what science is meant to do. It tries to explain it. One of the most common explanations proposed by researchers is a phenomenon known as cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia occurs when a person recalls information they were previously exposed to without realizing it. The memory does not feel like a memory. Instead, it feels new, original, and spontaneous. In children whose brains are still developing, this effect can be even stronger. In theory, James could have overheard conversations, seen images, or been exposed to information without consciously remembering it. Later, under emotional stress or through dreams, that information could resurface in a fragmented form. This explanation is scientifically plausible, and in many cases it accounts for similar claims. However, cryptomnesia alone does not resolve every aspect of the case. Some of the details James mentioned were not widely known, not commonly discussed, and not easily accessible to a toddler. The names, locations, and specific military references he described required a level of accuracy that challenges simple coincidence. This is where the explanation begins to strain. Another hypothesis suggests coincidence combined with confirmation bias. Humans are naturally inclined to notice patterns and ignore mismatches. When a few correct details align with historical records, the case appears extraordinary, even if other inaccuracies are overlooked. This explanation also has merit and must be considered. Yet even after applying these models, researchers are left with unanswered questions. And this leads to a deeper issue, one that goes beyond James's story. Modern neuroscience still does not fully understand how consciousness arises, how memories are encoded, or why subjective experience exists at all. We can measure neural activity, map brain regions, and track electrical signals, but the fundamental nature of awareness remains elusive. This gap in understanding is often referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. Because of this, cases like James's do not prove reincarnation, but they do expose the limits of what science can currently explain. They sit at the edge of knowledge, where evidence is incomplete and conclusions must remain tentative. And in those moments, science does something essential. It admits uncertainty. At this point, science does not deliver a final verdict. Some researchers suggest cryptomnesia, the unconscious recall of previously encountered information. Others argue coincidence, Some point to parental influence or subtle suggestion. All of these explanations are possible, but the problem remains. No single explanation accounts for every verified detail on its own, and this is where science does something essential. If it does not know, it admits it. Reincarnation has not been proven. Consciousness continuing after death has not been demonstrated. But cases like this clearly expose the limits of our current understanding. They remind us that the human mind, and possibly consciousness itself, still contains aspects science has not fully mapped. Maybe there is nothing after death. Maybe consciousness ends completely. Or maybe reality is far more complex than our current models allow. But perhaps the real question isn't what happens after death. Perhaps it's how we choose to live, knowing that death is inevitable,